Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz, and we've got a very good topic today. We are going to discuss anarchy, whether it's stable, whether it can produce the results that its proponents say it can. And our guest today is well equipped. He's studied the subject in depth. He's a professor of economics from George Mason University. Vincent Geloso, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So the anarchy that I'm most familiar with is what's called anarcho-capitalism. But I think anarcho-capitalism is a subset of a broader concept of anarchy. So just for some clarification, what is anarchy and what is anarcho-capitalism?
So, first, let's do the usual caveat. Anarchy doesn't mean chaos, it means order uh, without necessarily having a plan for it. So, there is no, you can have governance. So, the way I generally present it to students is when I talk about economics, is we care about governance and how do people create norms and institutions that govern behavior and allow us to trade with each other, and that can include government, but it doesn't necessitate government. So it's order without necessarily government. That's the way you want to think about what is meant by anarchy.
Now, is order a necessary component of
Yes.
anarchy? I thought anarchy just meant no central government, no governing.
No, because when we say order, people this is where it shows that people are really reflecting with the state too much in their mind, whereas I tend to start with a blank slate assumption. Um, the way I also say it to, and this is, I do this as an economist. So even though like I have some philosophical sympathies for anarchy as a thing, I'm still like an economist by training. But the way I say it is, the production of rule is itself a productive activities. And we produce rules everywhere in our lives, within our families, within our associations of friends, rules of politeness. You don't spit in my face while we talk. When you're in my house, please respect my property. This is stuff that we say to each other. These are rules. And the reason why we emerge rule is we need a stable framework to exchange. The importance of a stable framework of that we can expect what's going to happen in terms of behavior in the next unit of time or in the next round. We understand each other. We know that if, for example, like reputation is a form of rule, if you cheat and then I can tell everyone that you cheated, then you're going to get punished. And that works as a rule. It creates order. And inside this order, there's a stable set of expectations about how the world will work, and we can trade and we can benefit from that trade with each other and make the world a wealthier place. It's just that a lot of people think of rule as a having of forcibly must exist because of government. The reality is, and this there's a great term for it. John Hassness at Georgetown speaks of the obviousness of statelessness, that in the vast majority of our daily interactions, there isn't even the shadow of a state that regulates our behavior. It is market driven governance that gives us order, and that includes just the discipline of continuous dealing. That, since, for example, discipline of continuous dealing says that if we're going to trade with each other continuously over time, then my own future self creates governance right now, because if I cheat you now, you don't trade with me in the next period, and that means that future me is hurt by this. So this is a form of rule, this is a form of governance, this is a form of order that is created without force, without government per se. Government can enhance some order, some people would say, but it's not an obvious necessity per se for order to exist without states.
I largely agree with you. It sounds a lot like very Hayekian, that order sort of evolves and comes about. For instance, our use of language is one example he gives, that nobody invented language. It just came about and we
Yeah.
all live with the rules. But the idea that we're not operating with the shadow of the state, I think it's a little faulty. And just tell me if I'm wrong or how I'm wrong. But for instance, today I had a drive to a town hall in another town from mine. And as I was getting on the highway, there were two cars that were merging with me that were clearly ahead of me and one that was clearly behind me. So I made the assumption that I would fit in the space between the two cars in front of me and the one behind me. The guy that was behind me decided to speed up and almost ran me off the road. My initial inclination is pull up beside this guy and let him know what's what. Now, there's two deterrents there. One, the guy might be a nut and shoot me. That of course is there, and that I would say is outside the realm of the state. But I also am aware that if I end up in an altercation with this guy, there's a very real chance that I end up arrested. So even though the state, they're not following me around, I know it's there. Similarly, on this podcast, I have you as a guest, right? Now, I trust your word of honor that you're not don't have your telephone in the background recording it so you can rush to release the episode, right? But aside from that, I also know that I have copyrights on the show, that somebody can't just, it might not even be copyrights, it might be the other one, I'm not sure, it doesn't matter. But anyway, I know I have intellectual property in the show. So it doesn't matter that the state isn't right here. I still know it's there.
Yeah.
Right. So how does that fit with the idea of so much statelessness?
So, of course, the state. So, this is where, again, we're still talking. I want to make clear that we are talking about generally the idea of what is governance in and without government, right? So, we're not, I'm not making any statement about which is better right now. Of
Mm-hmm.
course, there is a shadow of a state in most transaction, but it's worth pointing out, and this is where there's a relevance to it. Very often, the rules that governments end up adopting and enforcing are rules that emerged previously through norms and tradition. So, for example, the common law was a form of market-based rule and traditions for how to resolve particularly recurrent conflicts, and we would then have traditions that said how we would that this is the way you resolve this. Iceland had stuff like this. The Irish have stuff like that. The Japanese, if you look at history of laws, you will find this in multiple societies. And then at one point, the state comes in and codifies these traditions inside bodies of legislation, which is different from law. A law can be without legislation, but legislation is what government creates to make laws. So it's a legislative act, in which case often what it does is it co-opts what used to be universal practices that were well embedded within society. So even sometimes what we think is the shadow of the state is something I would say is sometimes it's not even the shadow of the state, it's the shadow of previous market-based governance that existed and then it's co-opted. Of course, however, there are stuff where we there is clearly a shadow of things the state made that had no market-based test of governance. So it would be like a financial regulation where I can't do insider trading or something like this. So yes, I would like to do insider trading and maybe I could cheat right now, but I still think that I could be caught. So even though we operate in the weird netherworld of transactions, I could still be caught. So the shadow of the state there clearly exists. This idea is I wouldn't repudiate this. The thing I would point out is we really have to imagine a blank slate where if we want to think about statelessness and governments, we have to start from the very idea that what if we were just a bunch of individuals? How would we create order in a world to generate a stable framework for exchange so that we can benefit from exchanging from one another, from specializing, from not living in autarky? How would we generate a set of institution that does that? And what I point out is that doesn't necessarily necessitate a state. You can have a state that will do it, but then there's multiple ways you can provide governance with or without the state.
So when you mentioned the common law, and I'm not familiar with common law in Japan or even, well, Iceland a little bit, but not certainly not Ireland or Japan. But the common law in England, for example, even their constitution isn't written. It evolved from court decisions and custom and that sort of thing. But there was always the government in the background. I mean, their court system, the courts are the king's bench, for instance,
Yeah.
right? So there's still government, even though the law evolved, it was with the backdrop that there was an enforcer. Are We're going to get into the societies you studied in a second, but what I want to know is, are all these societies, is there some form of government in the background, whether we call it a state, whatever, but is there something in the back that is going to enforce these laws if there's violations of the laws?
So in the case you can mention, very often you'll find that yes, there is very often the shadow of a state that exists. But again, when I say it doesn't necessitate a state per se, is because we do have examples of societies that are able to generate this governance without any shadow of a state, at least for a long period of time. And this is what I point out to fellow economists is interesting to economists per se when you're studying institution, but also the classical liberals about the implication of what it means to the state. So it speaks. I do this as an economist, but there's, I think, lessons that classical liberals can learn from this. This is where it's relevant to study societies that uh, started from that blank slate, and we look at the trajectory of their institutional development, where there you will see forms of governance that emerge without necessarily a monopoly on violence, which is the definition of a state.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about the societies, the anarchic societies you studied. I know you studied England and then an area, I believe, in Quebec
Yep.
that you studied as well. So tell us a little bit about these and of what these societies consisted.
So right now, I can name 5 examples of societies that they're all frontier societies. So you want to think about these are places that were not very densely settled, and people arrive there, and they have essentially a blank slate. So the 5 examples I have is one that I recently discovered and I'm less familiar with, which speaks to old believers in Russia migrating to the frontier regions of Russia in the 18th and early 19th century. Uh, Acadia in Canada, which is modern parts of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. Iceland in medieval periods, and the Métis of the Canadian prairies. These examples work really well as illustration of governance under statelessness. And the common denominator they have in there is they start again from a blank slate. They have no governments that have any form of rule and no credible ability to even enforce these rules. People actually feel that they can ignore whatever edicts a king says miles away. And in these cases, what happens is we look at how they evolve governance mechanism, and they find ways to govern themselves. So the best example is by David Friedman with Iceland, and what he points out is migrants from Norway and some other Scandinavian countries went to Iceland between 825 and 1100. There's a large number of them that go to Iceland. Iceland's population goes from essentially zero to around 80,000 people. And on the island, you have no form of actual state. What happens is you have the word tribe does not correctly describe this, but essentially what you have is, I'm going to use tribe for simplicity, is I can be a member of a tribe, but I can shift allegiance between tribes, and I don't even need to be in a geographic area of which the tribe is. I can move, I can be on the east end of the island and say that I am a member of a tribe of someone on the west end of the island. And the idea is that within these tribe, there would be an elder of the group who would act, not necessarily an elder, but someone who has wisdom, but is also respected by everyone, who would act as an arbiter in conflicts. And he was making a profit from acting as an arbiter, a fair arbiter. That meant everyone would trust him to resolve and adjudicate differences between people. And also, if someone from an other tribe attacked me or hurt me, he would act on my behalf to get restitution for any damages that are done, either if I'm dead, restitution to my family. And not only that, I could sell to other members. If I was wrong, I could sell the right to enact restitution in my name. And so what David Friedman points out in that case is this is private governance. There is no state per se. This is largely a system of common rule where then these different elders meet and discuss. They end up creating a form of a parliament called the Alting. But it's essentially a place of deliberation between the different elders, and they deliberate over how to govern between these different groups. But there is no state at all. And this is similar for, it's in very different details, but somewhat similar for Acadia, very similar for the Métis of the Canadian prairies. And the part that used to be studied was, and this is the part where I'm contributing more, is that these were stable equilibriums for decent periods of time, and each of them had no state that existed per se. The part that's novel in what I'm saying is, because I'm an economic historian by training, is let's look at living standards. Is you could think that the reason why they have no state is that there's no point in having one because they're so poor. Right? There's a reason why most of the stateless societies in the world today are insanely poor societies where no one would prefer to leave, say, Manhattan for the tribes of inner Brazil. Right? No one would say this is a trade I want to do to not get a state. But if you compare them with their contemporaries, right, where you're comparing the stateless societies, say, of medieval Iceland with, well, the next most stateless society, or the one that has a state, but like the closest to that, in terms of like the weakest next state, as you want to think about it this way, it's England. And the Icelanders are matching that. They're as rich as the British were during the medieval period. They're richer than groups of people that have longer established state on the Mediterranean, such as the Syrians, the Byzantines, the Italians. So they seem to have very much higher living standards, or at least rivals. So there's no, the idea that I want to point out here is, what matters is if a set of institutions guarantee governance effectively and can generate the things that we care about, which is security, protections of property rights, a stable framework for exchange, then they can do as good, if not better, than societies where the state takes over the provision of these. So there is no inherent reason to believe empirically that statelessness means poverty. That's the point that I make. That it, as long as you get governance, there's different ways of getting it, and market-based governance, the ones you get, which is market-based governance, which you get under statelessness, which 100% of governance will be provided market-based, if you want, by these norms, civil society, but there will be no force of law, but force of legislation that does that. In these societies, you will find that it's 100% market based. So other societies could have a mix, could have like a mixture of both. Some societies could be like far more extreme, but within the spectrum from 100% market based to full totalitarian, there's different ways of providing governance. What I'm suggesting is it's not on that spectrum per se that you'll find a reason to believe that societies will be poorer and richer per se. What matters is the quality of the governance. And in fact, anything else equal, it looks like market-based governance is able to generate better outcome for some period of time. So this is where I also think I'm very novel. It's when I say for some period of time.
Okay, so David Friedman has said that there's no guarantee that an anarcho-capitalist society would be a free society.
Yes, he's correct.
And uh, Arnold Kling cites a guy named Mark Wiener, who also studied ancient Iceland, and he says yes, they had order, but what they didn't have was individual liberty. They didn't have freedom. What I'm wondering is, in these societies that you've studied, were individual rights secure? And by individual rights, I mean, in our modern understanding, a Lockean sense of what rights are and what freedom is.
I would tend to think that the Iceland case, that description is not correct per se, but there are stateless societies that are not, that you wouldn't consider very free. And I'm thinking of societies that are so small scale that probably there is like pretty much like a village violent person who's in charge, and it's possible that you would have a form of local authoritarian. So it's not an automatic thing that that a form of anarchy means like pure freedom. But from what you could read about the the Icelanders, they are very free people by the standard of the time. By a very large degree, they're very free. Same thing with the Acadians. Same things with the Métis of the Canadian prairies. Um, I think what's more important is, again, when I go back to governance, is you need some way for governance to emerge, for trade to happen. And that means like a stable framework for exchange. That's what you really need about. There are some better frameworks for exchange, but market-based societies market-based governance is really good at providing the better form of governance. The thing is that it's not a stable equilibrium. This is where all the anarcho-capitalists are getting way too excited over this. These are all fleeting episodes. They never last. And the reason for this is uh, that you will get a state regardless of what happens in the long run. One reason is if you become a rich, stateless society, you will invite the predation of another society, in which case you have to build a state, because the one thing states are really good at is organizing violence on a large scale. If you can't do that and you get invaded, you will get a state by force. So someone will impose it on you, or you have to build one to resist the predation of other states. Whichever is the outcome, you're still getting a state. You're getting it by force from someone else, or you're getting it to protect wealth that you've created from potential invaders. So, statelessness is not a stable equilibrium. It's generally a fleeting outcome of a short period of time where people find better ways of governing than establishing some formal rules. And in fact, this fits with what I was telling you earlier, that very often state end up copying norms and tradition and then just codify them. It's because on these frontier examples that I give, people had to experiment. People had to try out new things. They had to find which way in that new context they're in, with which they're very unfamiliar, what works. And the market-based test gives them what works. Once a certain amount of figuring it out has done, and there is a credible threat from abroad, we adopt these and codify them, and then the state just formalizes the rule. But you will get a state regardless. That's the point I really care about making, is that there is no particular reason for thinking that statelessness is bad. People are really good at providing governance without governments. That's the thing I keep pointing out to people. We don't need governments to do governance. Men and individuals are really good at doing this, because there is the benefit of exchange that comes in. And if you are able to create a stable framework for exchange, you reduce transaction costs, you expand the realm of trade that people can do, and trade makes us richer, in which case our own self-interest becomes a disciplining device that works very, very well. But there is always another way of getting rich, which is to use force and coercion. And in which case, sometimes you will need to do force and coercion yourself to resist the force and coercions of others, in which case you're forced to get a state. And then the question is, what is the better state that you can get? Like, what's the ideal state that limits those predations and maximizes growth or maximizes development without becoming worse than the disease it was supposed to fight, or the disease you got imposed with?
It sounds to me like what you're saying is that Nozick was correct, that
Yes.
ultimately a state is going to emerge.
Yes, the difference between what Nozick says. So yes, I'm very much inspired by Nozick, but what Nozick does is in the idea of these private security firms that compete, and then it makes sense that they eventually end up as a monopoly. In my case, that's not the mechanism. It's the same conclusion, but the mechanism is external threat. As soon as there is one guy who has an ability to attack you, you have to develop one yourself. So it's not the monop. So in the Nozick argument, and it works really well, it's also like an argument for why it's never stable, is you get private competing firms, and that means duplication of negotiation cost between like firms, as they say, like, okay, well, my client was hurt by one of your clients, so then we have to argue and debate and blah 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 blah, and this is costly. Eventually what happens is people realize that this is costly. As they merge into like a larger and larger security firm, there is one, guy alone, and that's the superior outcome. That's the Nozick argument. Mine is no, it's because you have to develop one to resist others. So by definition, it's not a stable equilibrium. You will always end up with one, but you could end up with multiple different states by regions. Because in the Nozick argument, this is where I don't talk about it much in my articles that have been published. But the Nozick argument is, why don't we have a international state that's for the only state for the entire world? Mine actually explains that. It explains why there could be a stop point at one frontier. This is where the next predator is, and this is the limit of my resistance to him. But I still prefer my set of institutions in my particular context relative to his institutions in his particular context. So this is where you get these starts of different unique jurisdictions of different states that happen, but you will get a state regardless. It's not a stable equilibrium. You get one either by conquest, which is this case for Iceland and the Acadians, or the Canadian prairies, or in the case of England, which had one of the weakest, so not necessarily, it was not stateless, but it was the weakest state you could find in Europe at that time. It developed one of the strongest states to resist the predation that its prosperity attracts. So whichever way you're forced to, you have to build a state to resist predation, or you get one by force.
So there's two questions that I come to my mind, and I agree with you. I think you're spot on about needing a state to defend against external predations. But what I'm wondering is, so you compare Iceland to its contemporaries, and you compare the Acadians to their contemporaries on the ground of financial well-being, crime, that sort of thing. But it seems to me that if you're going to judge anarchy or anarcho-capitalism, that's not the best comparison, even though for empirical work it is, because you can put them in the same, almost like a cateris paribus situation. But those societies that you're comparing them to weren't the type of society, for instance, that I would advocate or that Nozick would advocate. The minimal state, free market, where the government's limited to protecting life, liberty, and property in the administration of courts. They didn't have that. And they weren't industrial societies that were taking place, right? So, I mean, two cases that immediately come to my mind in the modern world that I don't know how, or actually three, how an anarcho-capitalist society would cope with it, even in a temporary unstable equilibrium, is one, for instance, patent law or intellectual property. If I have a defense agency that upholds the right to intellectual property, and you have one that doesn't, and then you use my intellectual property without my consent, I don't know how they resolve that. Another one is age of consent laws, which I don't believe they were dealing with in these societies, where, for instance, in some states, 17 is the age of consent. Some ages it's 16. Some states it's 18. So if I have a defense agency that says the consent age is 17 and yours says it's 18, and I'm 18 and dating the 17-year-old girl, that's perfectly legal according to mine, but according to yours it's not, and now your parents want to press charges, not your parents, but the girl's
Okay, so
the girl's parents.
there's two things in what you're asking. One is the moral dimension, and this is not the angle I take when I discuss this idea, the topic of statelessness. The moral dimension is a normative question. What I'm interested in is the positives, the descriptive of the world. Which one generates outcomes that are welfare improving?
Okay.
You could still, so for example, some socialists would say that on their own normative criteria, that Canada's a bad country, or the United States is a bad country. As an economist, I'm not well tooled for this, so I'm not sure how to answer the second part of what you're saying. But the first part is, I think it is the correct, to use contemporary, it is the correct answer. the correct answer to use the contemporary, because you want to make sure that what would be the information gleaned from comparing medieval Iceland to the United States today, is what you want to compare is the marginal difference between the non-state of then to the state of then. I think this is the correct way of making the comparison, because you want to check what's the marginal effect of getting a state or not getting a state. Here it's not, you're getting much more. You're getting the effect of technological development, et cetera, in the interceding two periods. Now, to answer some criticism that I expect might come in is, I actually think there is a better state than other states, right? So the point that I'm making is that there is no inherent reason to believe that the state is good, right? Or can lead to better outcome. This is what I want people to picture from my cases. Governance can, a state, non-states governance does not mean bad outcomes. It can lead to very good outcome. It can lead to bad ones. But people have this completely different assumption where state is the way to create the good outcomes. Whereas I say no, that is incorrect. There are ways to get good outcomes without states. But if you're going to get a state regardless, then the question is, what gives you a good state? So from my lessons um, of uh, of why it's an unstable equilibrium, and that market-based governance is really much better than we think, then it tells us lessons about, once we're forced to have a state regardless, how do we get the best version of it? Or if you are a classical liberal like me, you will say, what is the least bad states? Now, different economists would have different answers to that. I tend to have a very classical liberal answer of a very limited state, but then that gives you the question of, what are the constraints on the rulers? What limits the rulers to do the things that are productive and good and promote the expansion of well-being for society, that protects the rights of those who can't exert their rights very easily? So that would be, like, for example, minors who could be violently attacked by people who are adults. So that would, like, how do you get these rules? Well, then there are better states than others. How do we get those better states? And that, I think, is what, the way I'm saying it, gives us much more lessons about what gives us the closer, at least, to an ideal state, or
So,
thinking about what is the ideal state.
so if you extrapolate from the studies that you've done, the empirical work on the Iceland and the Acadians, to modern world, do you think that in the absence of government, I don't know, the people sometimes differentiate between government and state, but I'm going to go with state because I just mean an organization that has a monopoly on retaliatory force over a geographic area. Do you think that an anarcho-capitalist system could produce the highly technical industrial world that we live in today? I understand it's a hypothetical. That
Okay.
just
So to
asking
get
me
that
to
hypothetical to
speculate.
work, I would say the following. Imagine that the cost of forming a state is insanely high. Okay. So we'll make it so prohibitively high that it just cannot emerge. Okay. That means that every form of governance we'll have to get must be based on some form of discipline of continuous dealings, where there must be that if I behave poorly, there I'm aware that there's some costs to me that occur in the future. And this is where, like, Adam Smith's impartial observer comes in, is that there might be someone somewhere who might be looking on what I'm doing, and this would hurt me in the future. Right? So this would be, like, for your hypothetical to work, it would mean that we would have to base everything on voluntary cooperation, where it's our own future selves that police each other. And this you will see in a lot of settings in society, much more than we realize. The early internet is largely void of government intervention, and you will see the emergence of norms on there on how to behave, on how to allow the trade to continue. Of course, there's some bad behavior, things that we would judge bad per se, but the reality is that there were norms and institutions in the early days of the internet where the state was actually just what I described, unable to regulate behavior. It had no ability in the early days of the internet to do anything of meaningful importance to it. It's only later when it caught up technologically that it was able to start stepping in that world. But the early technologies of information happen very much in a stateless situation where the governance is market based between players in that sphere. So, yes, I think it is entirely possible to get a very highly innovative world where cooperation is sustained between players without a recourse to violence. But the thing is that eventually the internet becomes a very powerful source of wealth. The state becomes attracted to it. So not only does it start developing the abilities, it starts developing the attraction towards it because it means a lot. And sometimes it allows people in other sphere that used to be regulated to escape the state, and the state doesn't like that, so then it steps in and it wants to regulate it. So then even within a sector, this analogy of you get a state regardless is that sector gets co-opted. But the reality is very often these innovations happen in area where the state has a more limited reach and it's able to self-govern. So yes, I think, and this is the key point I will keep reiterating, is we do not need states to develop. This is the key point I want to make. We do not need state to have rich industrial advanced societies. However, we will get a state regardless in the end. So the question again is how do we, if we're going to get a state, how do we get the one that is the least worse or is channeled in ways to do productive things, or at least does its protective duties the way it should?
What is your answer to that question?
Well, this is where I'm much more, I don't think there's a single answer to that. I think what there is a single set of methods. Is what we want is rulers to have, and this is very much a public choice answer. So I'm an economist and I'm at the Public Choice Center at George Mason University. So of course I'm going to say what I'm about to say. So what I want is federalism, that I want people to be able to move with their feet, to vote against rulers with their feet, thus escaping with their wealth from rulers. So the ability of people to exit is a very powerful regulator of the state, forces the bad reflexes of states to be contained. So we want that for sure. We want mobility of capital. We want mobility of individuals. We want the ability to punish rulers. So this is where James Buchanan talks about the importance of elections as a way of cycling through rulers. And it's not because elections represent the general will. I think that's a bullshit story anyway. I think the reason why elections are a useful tool is the next guy over could be voted in next time, and he's the one that's going to treat us like shit. So maybe we should behave a bit better if he can be voted in the next turn, right? So this is something you would want to have. You want to have liberal democracy. You want to have checks and powers. You want to have divided powers between different branches of government. It's how would it change from place to place? You could have a parliamentary system. You could have a congressional system. It's the answer of how is much more different. But the idea, and this is the key point I keep making out, is you want constraints. You want to have a system of carrots and sticks that incentivize rulers to not give in to the worst predatory reflexes of the state. And you want to give them rewards for not indulging in those. So if they say, okay, I'm going to use much more of the signals I get from markets to get better institution, and in which case I get a bigger pie in the future. So yes, I'm going to steal 1% of everyone's income, but I'm going to make the pie bigger by incorporating market information or things that come from market governance that emerge. So I'm going to co-opt them, but not too much overly aggressively regulate them, and I'm going to allow the pie to grow. And this, in essence, gives us the way I always picture this is, and it's not my analogy, but I love it. There's three horses that exist in the world. There's the horse of innovation, which I call the Schumpeterian horse after Joseph Schumpeter. There's the Smithian horse, which is the horse named after Adam Smith for specialization. And there's the Leviathan horse, the horse of Hobbes, which is the government. You want the first two to run as fast. The first and the third one is always like latched on to them. It has a rope that connects it to them. So it will always run at least like some level it will be dragged on by them. But as long as it doesn't get ahead of those two other horses, we're good. In fact, that third horse should basically run just right behind them, not prevent them from running faster. So it shouldn't try to pull back, and it shouldn't try to run faster than them, because in which case it will make them fall. This is the way I picture the lesson that I'm getting from my interpretation of the unstable equilibrium of statelessness. Is the statelessness is able, the market-based governance is really good at generating really good outcomes for societies. But since you're going to get a state in any case, how do you preserve these good features of market-based governance and prevent the bad parts of government from growing too large and then snuffing down everything that works?
So this Schumpeterian horse that you have, right? This is going to destroy things that are no longer useful in order to make room for things that are. It's going to do away with the horse and buggy, for instance, to make room for the automobile. It's good. I'm of course expanding your analogy. If Schumpeter's creative destruction, right? That
Yep.
you have innovation that replaces things that are outdated. The problem that we run into is, for instance, the Rust Belt. They don't want their jobs to be gone by creative destruction. So they'll vote for politicians that are going to protect their jobs, that are going to keep us stuck there. I don't think that's inevitable. I just think it's what happens to occur. And that my question or my assertion, and I want to see your thoughts on it, is that ultimately to have a free society where the government is restrained is dependent on the people that live in that society developing philosophy or respect for freedom, for capitalism, to understand that it's better in the long run if these jobs go out of existence, because we're going to have something better. We're not going to be stuck with the horse and buggy. We're going to end up with Teslas or Fords or whatever. Would you agree with that? That it's ultimately dependent on us, the people?
I'm not sure I like the framing of that question. And not only that, I have not thought about it this way. So I'm not sure how much of an answer I can give to that
Okay,
and be
fair
honest and
enough.
not bullshit. But I can give you an answer for how much I think this, like, because your argument is essentially how much I can separate your argument into two parts. The first one is essentially you're asking, does capitalism breed its own enemies? And that one I can answer in a second. Second one is you're asking, do we need to have a culture of freedom to preserve the institutions that generate what economic freedom and political freedom generate? I, I I'm not sure how much I can answer that per se without, I have to think more about this. But for the first one, I can give you an answer. Is I don't think the Schumpeterian argument about breeding its own enemies works really well. So I have a book chapter with Alex Tabarrok where we look through the relation between democracy and capitalism. Some people argue that capitalism kills democracy. This is your standard, more left-leaning argument, but you will find some conservatives who hold on to it to some degree. So it's not an ideological argument, even though it's predominantly on the ideological left. And then within classical liberals, you will find some people who argue that democracy snuffs capitalism, which is the Schumpeterian argument. And when we look through the empirical evidence for it, there isn't much that defends it. One reason for this is societies that generate the creative destruction generate the creative part as well. So, yes, they generate enemies of growth and enemies of the institutions, but they also generate friends, people who want to push for them. So, it generates forces that nullify each other. but also via democracy, also tends to find ways to limit, like the people can voice, people can ease their tensions, people can participate in deliberation, and at the very least it cools down, it gives the time at least to slow down the process so people can recuperate. So I don't think the Schumpeterian argument holds very well, because it creates as much enemies as it creates friends of these institutions via the creative destruction process. So I think Schumpeter was way too concentrated on the destruction part and the enemies that it breeds, but also like the intellectuals that become so rich because of capitalism and then they start attacking it. Well, then there's also people who benefit from this very big growth, in different ways, and they realize it, and they're better able because of development to fight those bad ideas. So I think these forces are canceled. I don't think there's an inevitability that the Schumpeterian argument brings. I think the innovation can be endless.
So, in addition to the Schumpeterian, and I concede it was my fault for limiting to it, but I really had in mind a broader idea about people, for instance, supporting the welfare state or the war on drugs, or all the people that supported the COVID policies, whatever, is that people by and large support government growth when they think it benefits them, even if it doesn't. Minimum wage is a good example. And that's what I meant by people having to understand that while it may appear to be in their interest to enact these policies, in the long run it isn't. That's what I meant. I wasn't limiting it just to creative destruction.
Okay, then of course I think that talking about ideas is important, and I do think that telling people that states don't give them rights, their rights pre-exist the state, and the state can only violate these rights, or recognize that people can exert them. So I am very much uh, in the natural tradition of, I'm very much Locke immune, if you want. Uh, Telling people this is very important. And then saying that there is a proper role for the state and it should not go beyond this. We can debate what that proper role is, but yes, of course, I think talking about this is important and telling them that there are different types of states. So I like the James Buchanan way of saying it. There's three states. There's the protective, the productive, and the last one he calls redistributive, but it's also predatory. So the protective is the regalian state that just night watchman. Okay. Productive is the state does some stuff that enhances market. This is where they do like public goods, lighthouses, blah, 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 blah. And then there is the redistributive state, in which case it's the state starts using its powers to redistribute to party friends, to constituencies, so that they can stay in power more easily or benefit themselves directly. So this is where you would get uh, different types of predatory. You could get democratically predatory, or you could get authoritarians predator. You could get a different type of them. And that last state is going to give you in the long run bad outcomes. The question that Buchanan would say is, how do you stay at least between the other two, right? So you stay within these. And I think the role of ideas, going back to your question, is I'm more comfortable in answering this, is talking about the role of ideas keeps you in those two, between or in one of those two other states, and prevents you from going to the third one, uh, whichever way you define the limits between the second and third. Uh, but beyond that, what guarantees you that preservation? I don't know. I think it's a mixture of different things. I don't. If I knew the exact recipe, I wouldn't tell anyone and make a fortune out of it. Uh, but I don't have an answer beyond this. But I think what I'm able to give you with everything I've said is an ability to correctly comprehend the nature of the state, the nature of development and how we get it, and how do we preserve an environment that allows for development. I think these are the three lessons you can get from my work, rather than saying is anarcho-capitalism feasible and good. Is no, it's that's not the question I'm trying to answer. Is I'm trying to use the anarcho-capitalist conversation to try and comprehend how do we get development, how do we get growth, how do we get wealthier, more prosperous societies where people's living standards continually increase, where there's flourishing, where people can meet different types of needs, some of which will be very hard to measure with dollar sign, but which matter for living a life that is worth living. How do you get those and preserve them? That I think is the lesson I think my work is able to give us via a discussion of the economics of anarchy and anarcho-capitalism.
Excellent. Thank you so much for being with us today. I really appreciate it. Where can people find you and where can they find your work?
So yeah, vincentgeloso.com, you can find series of my writings. So they're mostly academic journals, but I also write frequently for the general public. So at aier.org, so I write for the American Institute for Economic Research. I'm also a senior economist with the Montreal Economic Institute in Canada and the Fraser Institute. So you can find my stuff on their website. And I talk about economics every day on my Twitter feed at Vincent Geloso. So, or my X feed, I should say. I still am unable to retrain my brain on this, but you can find me there. And I emphasize again, I am very much a classical liberal family member. I've never known exactly where in the tent I am, like more libertarian than anarchist, more classical liberal than blah blah blah. I've never really cared exactly what the label is. I know which family I'm a member of, and that's all that matters. But I am first and foremost an economist. So the classical liberal thing comes second. So if you follow me on X, you will find much more discussions of economics, of economic thinking, of economic history, that you will find there, with an occasional classical liberal rant about something in the outside world that happens.
All right. Well, thank you very much again. For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Leibowitz. Till next time.